Tonight's program is Tim Gallagher, who's going to talk to us about saving the Peregrine Falcon. 6 decades of raptor conservation inspired by a single charismatic species. I stole this picture off Facebook. You can steal pictures really easily off Facebook. You took the picture. He worked as the editor of Living Bird magazine for a long time and has authored or co-authored numerous books. He's gone on lots of expeditions in search of birds, particularly woodpeckers, and tonight he will tell us of the history of saving Peregrine Falcon.
Okay. So it's great to be here. Place where I actually worked here for, I think, 26 years. I mean, when there was a little building at first, and then we moved over here, but it's a great place. Yeah. I feel like I've been involved with the Peregrines since I was a kid. Oh, I should start with Louis Agassiz Fuertes, who was the first president of the Cuba Bird Club. What was it, 1913? And until his death in 1927. And such an amazing person. And I'm very sorry that the Fuertes room doesn't exist anymore back there, because I really loved that place. But, and he loved peregrines. He found that Teganic Falls eyrie in 1909 and told Arthur Allen about it, who then took this amazing picture. And my mother, when I was 12 years old, she bought me this book, A.C. Bent's book, Life Histories of North American Birds of Prey, and it had this picture in it, and I just loved it. It's still my favorite picture of a peregrine eyrie. Even though Arthur Allen cheated a little bit, he and a friend put a tree branch down there, so that, hoping a bird would perch on it and make the perfect photograph. And it worked. He came back and he saw that birds had been there. Some of the bark had gotten knocked off it, and he was there for like 15 minutes, and that bird landed, and he got his picture. This is like, I think it was 1926, but anyway, back to more serious stuff. There was something going on with the peregrines. People started to notice in the early 1960s. Suddenly, there weren't very many around anymore. And what's going on? And it was here and in Europe. And there were theories about it. I mean, could it have been some kind of virus, or there isn't enough prey? I mean, some people talked about, the passenger pigeons got wiped out. That was an important food source for the eastern birds. Maybe that was a delayed response from that. But then there was DDT, which Rachel Carson had written Silent Spring just a couple of years earlier, and so it was all in there, but no one knew for sure. And here's a little movie that Arthur Allen took in 1941 of the peregrines at Teganic. And what's interesting is they were there for all those years. He'd been watching those birds since 1909. And in 1946, they abandoned the site. And I found this thing Arthur Allen wrote in a book in the 1930s. And he talked about how often one of the birds at Teganic was shot by an irate poultryman, but the survivor secured a new mate. It was interesting that he said often. It wasn't once or twice or occasionally, like they often did. But at that point, there was a good floating population, so they were able to, get another mate really quick, and until 1946. So what was going on? Joe Hickey was very interested in this. He had found a lot of eyries and peregrine eyries in the late 30s and early 40s. He wrote an important paper in 1942, and he wanted to know what was going on. So he asked a couple of his colleagues, Dan Berger and Chuck Sindler, if they would go and check a lot of these eyries in the east and see if they could figure out what's going on. And that's not Chuck Sindler, that's Fran Hammerstrom on the right, who I got to know both these people later. But anyway, they went to 133 eyries, even went all the way down to Alabama and up by Canada, went, checked 14,000 miles on their old Volkswagen. And I think I had the twin sister of that Volkswagen. I had one that looked just like that way back. But they didn't find any. They weren't, the nests weren't occupied. They went when they should have had young, and it should have been easy. And I mean, they'd sit by each eyrie for an hour or so, and sometimes even fire a rifle so the sound would echo down the cliff and flush anything off, and they didn't see any. So this is when they figured out these birds aren't breeding east of the Mississippi anymore. And so this really lit a fire under Joe Hickey, and he decided he wanted to have this huge conference, invite people from all over the world to come and really figure out what was going on. And this was I've gone to lots of scientific conferences, and it's always like people are out in the hallways kind of partying and talking to each other and having a good time. This was like no one wanted to miss anything. They were hanging on the edge of their seat, and they really wanted to know what was going on with these birds. And he really invited a lot of people, even people from the pesticide industry. He wanted people to say what they thought was going on, and he invited a lot of falconers. And I'm a lifelong falconer, and I have an interesting connection with this Madison conference. I didn't go to it, but the next year, a friend of mine, I was 16, my friend was 17. We wanted to go to a falconer meet in South Dakota in 1966. And we drove all the way there in a clunker car, broke down a couple of times, camping out, almost starved to death. But most of these people were there. All these people, like Tom Cade didn't come, but Jim Menderson, Dan Berger, Steve Herman, Clayton White, all these people. And it was the first time they'd gotten together since Madison. And it was like the whole thing was relived. They were just doing all art. I was like a fly on the wall, and it was really quite amazing. And one interesting thing about Madison was Derek Radcliffe from England came, and he had these slides of showing areas where the birds had been extirpated and areas where DDT was being sprayed. And he put two slides together in a slide projector and jammed it in there, and they lined up perfectly. And that really kind of convinced a lot of people right there. But, they had these people from the pesticide industry that were coming and going, well, this couldn't have. I mean, it might have killed 2 or 3 pairs, maybe, but you're talking about hundreds of birds that are gone. And it just couldn't have happened. And some of these were disappearing in the 1940s, like the Teganic birds, and they just didn't believe it. But this guy, Jim Rice, a falconer from Pennsylvania, he stood up and said, "Damn it, north, south, east, west, it's pesticides, pesticides, pesticides." Everyone stood up and applauded, Oh, and this is Fran Hammerstrom. I met her at the meet. She was really an interesting person. And she was at the University of Wisconsin at Madison too, and worked with, Joe Hickey. And at one point, he had all these people he was inviting, and he said, "Do you think maybe we should invite some falconers? I mean, you must know a lot of them because she was a falconer." And she said, "Well, half these people are falconers." And all these scientists, Of course, a falconer would want to study birds of prey. And Morley Nelson was there. He's an interesting person. I don't know if you've ever gone to Boise, Idaho, and the Snake River area. There's that Morley Nelson, bird sanctuary and there's so many prairie falcons and golden eagles nesting in that canyon. It's just an amazing place. I'm going to be there in a couple of weeks, but he's an amazing person. But what was very interesting, people really hadn't bred birds of prey. I'll mention a little later, but falconers 100 years back, they just didn't do it. they caught wild ones. And, but he had a peregrine that laid a clutch of eggs and was incubating them and everything. And he took them away and he put some young prairie falcons with her and she raised them. And so this is kind of stuff that was interesting. You know, this showed what you could do. And then, of course, there was Tom Cade. He was a professor at Syracuse University then, but he was on sabbatical leave in Africa, like studying battle-arrow eagles and things. And they invited some people from the Soviet Union and East Germany and stuff, and some people, their government wouldn't let them come over here. Maybe they thought they were defect or something. But Joe Hickey, he really wanted Cade to come, and he financed it with some of that money and brought him over. And he was just, he really wanted to get these birds breeding in captivity, saw that's the way to do it. And he got hired at Cornell a couple of years later, and he actually insisted that he would come to Cornell as a professor if they would, help him build a hawk barn, a breeding facility for these birds, and they agreed to it. And David Peacock, an interesting character in this too, how those pesticide people were saying, well, it couldn't have happened in the 1940s, that they, what happened to the birds crashing their numbers. And he borrowed some peregrine eggs from the Western Foundation of Vertebrate Zoology in LA, and that were taken in the late 40s. And he sampled from them, and he found that the membrane inside, they were loaded with the DDE, the metabolite of DDT. And it kind of really proved that this is probably what got the Taganic birds. Because they used DDT a lot during World War II, like when they were going to invade some of these Japanese islands and things. And but then, like about 1945, they just started using it like crazy in the United States, all over. And that's when the birds started really crashing. And then Richard Fife, he was like the Tom Cade of Canada. He set up a huge breeding project, which I visited once years ago in Wainwright, Alberta. And they produced hundreds of peregrines and released them. And I'm putting in, Clayton White was an important figure there, wrote some papers. And he and Granger Hunt are, as far as I know, the only people still living who attended that conference. Like, I've been looking around, and I've spoken to both of them within the last couple of months. Clayton White's close to 90, and Granger's about 86. We're getting together in a couple of weeks when I'm in Idaho. But he worked at the Peregrine Fund for decades. But he was very young when he went to Madison. He was working on his master's, and it just turned his life around. He just dedicated himself to, studying these birds and helping restore them. And he's still looking at the birds. He's got several eyries near where he lives in Northern California. Oh, a bit about myself. I was always, for some reason, I was always really crazy about birds. I trained a parakeet when I was 6 years old, and then I remember raising a sparrow a year or two later that fell out of its nest. And then I had homing pigeons. But at the age of 12, I got a kestrel. It took over my life. I wanted to fly this bird. And this was at a time, like now, to be a falconer, you have to take an exam, and you have to get a sponsor who lets you be an apprentice with them for at least 2 years. And after that, and you have to build a hawk house that's up to code and it's inspected. And it's very complicated. And eventually it takes years to become a master falconer. You can be a general in as little as 2 years if they sign off on you. But back then, you just paid the money and got a license. And the only problem was, it's like a fishing license or something. But the only problem was, I was 12 years old, and you had to be 16 in California to get a falconry license. So I'm out in this field, letting my kestrel chase house sparrows around and stuff, and a game warden comes by, and he stops me, and what are you doing? You got a permit? Blah, 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 blah. And, I said, no, I didn't even know you needed one. And he said, oh, yeah. And how old are you? And I said, I was 12. He said, well, you look like you're taking good care of it, so I'm not going to confiscate it. But you need to get one of your parents to get a falconry permit. So, I said, okay. And I went home. I was afraid to ask my dad. So I talked to my mom. My mom got a license. So about the first 3 years, I had this license that said I was Daphne Gallagher. And, I was out hunting a couple of weeks later in the same field, and that guy saw me, and he came out and helped me flush some sparrows. My bird caught one. And he made me, he said, let me see your permit now. And he looked at it and kind of smirked and said, well, way to go, Daphne. So later that season, I released the kestrel and I trapped a redtail. And I was hunting jackrabbits and cottontails. And I had to ride my bicycle out. Like after school, I'd get off school and I'd get on my bike and start riding to some fields that were several miles away. And often coming back, it was starting to get dark, and my bird would just go to sleep, tuck his head behind his back. And I don't know what people thought I had on my hand. And so at this point, like this bird actually prevented me from being a track star, because the junior high rows at school, they had a little track meet, and I beat all their best people. And so the coach really wanted me. And he said, I said, I can't do it. I'm too busy. And he said, what are you, a businessman or something? I didn't want to tell him that I'm secretly a falconer named Daphne. And then, shortly after I got back from Centerville from the falconry meet, I got this is probably the first bird I rehabbed. This was a prairie falcon I trapped out in the desert. She wasn't doing well. She had a cactus spike rammed into her foot, and it was all infected. It was terrible. And so I pulled it out, and I put medicine on it and everything. And it was kind of like Androcles and the lion. She was always really easy to work with. Prairie falcons are, famously difficult birds. They can be bad-tempered. And I flew her the rest of the season, and I released her in the spring up on a rocky crag out in the Mojave Desert. And the next year when I was out there was a prairie falcon eyrie that hadn't been there the year before. And I like to think it was her. I don't know if it was or not, but it was good. Anyway, enough about me. But this is sad. You see, I never throw anything away. I was just digging through a box recently. I found all the old program, 1966. And here's Richard Fife. He was at, Madison. And Heinz Meng wasn't there, but he's an important figure I'll talk about soon. Jim Anderson, very important researcher from Colorado. And there's the newspaper. And there's Fran Hammerstrom and her eagle. Now these guys, Dan Berger was the one who went out for Joe Hickey and went all over looking at all his eyries. But these guys, he and Jim Anderson, they'd recently gotten back from this trip. They floated the whole length of the Mackenzie River looking for peregrine eyries. And being a kid, it just, whoa, I want to do that. And years later, actually, he did go to Greenland with Jim Anderson. And this was Frank Beebe, who was co-author of a book on falconry, but he presented a couple of papers about the Peel subspecies of peregrine that nests in the Pacific Northwest. He was a Canadian from Vancouver Island. Now, this is kind of interesting. Don Hunter, who lived in Centerville, he was at Madison, and he set up a meeting right after the Madison conference ended, and it was about forming a new organization, the Raptor Research Foundation. And he was the chair of that meeting, and a lot of people attended it. And I mean, probably most of you have heard of the Raptor Research Foundation. It's a very respected organization now, and its second meeting was held at Centerville, and all of us were invited to go, and I just, it was amazing. I couldn't believe it. Because at that point, I didn't really know how bad these birds off were, how bad off they were. I mean, and it really kind of turned my life around. I wanted to try to help these birds. Oh, and this is the first, I joined it. It was like $1 a year. That you can see the 4-cent Lincoln stamp on there. And it's when I was living in Buena Park. And like here's that was the first issue, January '67, and there's one from last year. So they've come a long way. Oh, and I don't know if many of you know Jim Weaver, but he ran this project for Tom Cade at Cornell. And my friend Rich Wilson and I, who drove up there, we didn't know where to stay. And Jim and another guy were camping out along this river, and they said we could camp out with them. And we had these little California sleeping bags. I think mine went up to my chin. I'd had it when I was a Cub Scout. And Jim, and he had a couple of peregrines perched there by them, and his friend Ken Sterner had a gerfalcon. And, it was great, except it was so cold. My teeth were chattering so much I couldn't sleep, and the river froze in the night. And the next day, we're walking through Centerville, and there was a bakery, and they had this big cake with a stooping peregrine on it. And I said, "Welcome, falconers." And we just looked like, refugees, bags on our eyes, and we were staring at this. And the woman comes out and says, "Oh, come on in." And she started feeding us Danish rolls and stuff. And he said, "Oh, you're from California? My daughter lives in California." And next thing you know, she's married to a local farmer, and they invite us to stay with them. We live like kings. We're eating venison and pheasant and the best apple pie ever, homemade. And anyway. Oh, and I met Bill Heinrich, who was the same age as me. And we were driving around. We saw him driving a Ford Falcon, and he had a goshawk with him. And he became a really important part of the Peregrine Fund. He was there for years, like 36 years, crazy. And 25 years later, I ran into him again. We were working on this project, trapping and banding peregrine falcons on the Texas coast at Padre Island. And, this is kind of crazy, but you see how that ATV is on that Zodiac. We'd have the board tipped like this and drive up it, and then it'd flop like that. And then, we'd drive across that channel to get to North Padre Island. It was insane. We almost lost one time. I mean, yeah. But exciting times. And that's Bill in the middle. Oh, and Bob Berry was also at Centerville. And he, during the little meeting we had at Centerville, he was talking about his efforts to breed goshawks in captivity, which hadn't been successful yet. But he's a very interesting person. He's been on the Lab of Ornithology's administrative board now for 15 or 20 years. And he also was one of the founders of the Peregrine Fund, and a very interesting guy, a major donor for the lab and for, Peregrine Fund. Now, as I mentioned, it was rare for birds to ever been bred in captivity. I mean, this German Rensvaler in 1942, as Allied bombs were falling on the city, he got a pair of birds to nest, because the male had a broken wing anyway and couldn't be flown, and they actually produced one young bird. But it was pretty rare. People were trying. This guy, Larry Schramm in Oregon, got a Peel's peregrine to produce one young in '68. But now Heinz Meng, he actually studied with Arthur Allen. He got his PhD in, I think, 1951, working, studying Cooper's hawks. And I met him at Centerville. And he was a very interesting guy. He already, at that point, had tried to breed some peregrines like a couple of years earlier. He'd gotten some that he'd trapped wild and then molted into adult plumage and put them together. And they did some courtship activity, but as we know now from experience, it's very difficult to get a wild-caught bird to breed in captivity. You really need to, raise them with humans. And but he did get a pair of Peale's peregrines, and they produced one young in 1971. And what was interesting, the next year he double clutched them. He got 7 birds out of that one pair, and that was like revolutionary. It was just like chickens. If you keep taking eggs away from chickens, they just recycle and they keep laying. And peregrines more or less do it too. And so later people were double and triple clutching, and so it really took off. I got to know Heinz really well when I moved here to New York, because he was a regular fixture at every falconry meet and picnic, and he was a professor for years at SUNY New Paltz. And he gave his pair to Tom Cade, and so it really helped get things going. And that was just part of the hawk barn. There was another part that was sort of two-storied, and I couldn't find a picture of it. I don't know why I didn't take pictures of all these things. I guess I didn't think people would knock them down. And that's Jim Weaver. What's interesting, he really didn't have any intention. He and a friend just came up to see what was going on at Cornell and what the facility looked like and all that. He had no intention of really coming there to stay or work or anything. But there were some things he didn't like. You always use vertical bars for raptors, because if you had horizontal, they'd grab on and maybe break their tail feathers and stuff. So you got horizontal, so they don't do that. But these were wooden dowels, and some of them were breaking. He said, no, you got to get metal, little thin metal pipe, And then the perches, he thought he wanted to change them. And so next thing you know, he moved here, and he was here for like 20 years, just running the show, and was a major part of it, figuring out how to do it. And this really, it was almost like factory production, and they'd have the eggs in an incubator and hatch them, and then raise the young by hand for like a week and a half or so, and then give them to the adults to raise. And they just really got really good at it, at producing these birds. Yep. And he's doing this chip, chip, chip. The birds. I don't know if this is a patriotic theme or what. It looks like red, white, and blue, on their heads. Maybe it was the 4th of July. Oh yeah. So it was really something. But they tried some releases in '74, but '75 they really made they had a lot more birds. And of course, like me, Tom Cade was totally fascinated with Teganic and really thought, wow, we got to get the birds nesting in Teganic again. And so That's Jim Weaver again with a box of Peregrines. I can't imagine them letting us do something like that together. But you know, the Peregrines, come on. They put 3 birds there, and the idea was, I mean, it's an old technique from falconry, hacking birds, where they either have a box up on a post of some kind, or sometimes they'd even take a wagon or a coach up to the top of a high hill in open country. And I kind of think they call it hacking, and I think it might have something to do with that, because you think of hackney coaches and things like that. And they'd let the birds go and feed them secretly without knowing people are giving their food. And they start going further and further afield. They're learning how, they're starting to chase stuff. But you have to get the birds back in. If you're a falconer hacking them, you have to get them back in before they can start catching stuff, because then they're gone. They'll disperse. And Tom Cade turned that around, and like that's what he wanted them to do. So he just kept them out there till they dispersed. And you know, yeah. And it really was looking good for these birds. They fledged, and they're flying up and down the canyon. And you know, the birds do have a tendency to come back when they become breeding age. They'll come back usually to the area they were from, and you know, perhaps nest there. And that was the hope. But sadly, the one bird disappeared, and then about a day later, another one disappeared, and they had telemetry on them, so they could just a tiny radio tag, and they went around searching and searching, and they found this great horned owl pellet, you know, where they cough up the bones and feathers or fur of things they catch, and you know, it was peregrine feathers and with an antenna. I mean, they tracked down their transmitter, and they caught the last bird, and it was really tragic, because I know they all wanted that, especially Tom Cade. You know, he really wanted the birds to nest there, and now that's what I just said, so I won't bother. But they did start, this is the time when they started doing city releases. And the thought was, you know, there aren't as many of those dangers there. Because, you know, you got these birds, you're releasing them, and they don't have parents to protect them. And they're out in the wild, and there's, you know, great horned owls. And out west, they were having problems with golden eagles and Allen. And so they started doing that, and the hope was that eventually the cities would be inundated and they'd start going to other areas and spreading out. And it happened, you know. Suddenly they had a ton of nests in Manhattan, and then every bridge from there to Albany had peregrines nesting on it, and then they're on the Shawgunks and the Catskills and the Adirondacks, and finally the Finger Lakes, you know. We got a lot of birds around now. And out west, a lot of the ones out west there were still pairs. Most of them got wiped out, but there were still enough pairs, but a lot of times their eggs were failing. And sometimes, this is when I got involved. And in Fort Collins, Colorado, they set up another facility, the Peregrine Fund. And the idea, of course, was they wanted to have 2 widely separated facilities where they're breeding them. Because if a virus came in, you could wipe out your whole thing. But if you got them separated a couple thousand miles apart like that, it's good. And that's Jim Weaver again. He got around, you know. But a lot of times they take thin-shelled eggs away and put them in an incubator and you can humidify it, and there's not a bird sitting on it, so that they're much more likely to hatch. You see, the DDT and DDE, it inhibits their calcium production when they're laying eggs, so it's pretty bad. And at this point in the 1970s, this was the first peregrine nest I ever went to, in Morro Rock, and they were failing. In fact, the first bird I saw there, the female, she died short time later, and she had a broken egg in her oviduct. So. I always feel like my life has been bookended by these two eyries. I actually, I was in college and I wanted to write an article about what was going on. So I've been talking about this junk for a long time, but for my school magazine, and I went up to Santa Cruz. UC Santa Cruz had the Santa Cruz Predatory Bird Research Group. And it was the only university besides Cornell that was doing something like that to bring the birds back. And I went up there to visit Brian Walton and all the other people, and I wrote an article about it. And it actually, it won a couple of big writing awards, like Hearst Foundation, and that turned my life around, because that's how I ended up in magazine journalism, really, and I wanted to write about conservation issues. But I went up there and did that, and before you know it, when I graduated from college, I went back up there and worked for them, and it was pretty amazing. Oh, that was Mike Farrell from MASH. He came out one time with some peregrines, but we were like taking the eggs off them because the eggs were breaking. We were taking the eggs off and putting dummy eggs in. At one point, we substituted some young prairie falcons to keep their interest up. And then the Peregrine Fund started giving us birds. Oh, that's me in the middle when I had more hair and darker, Oh, and I don't know how many of you know Phyllis Dagg, but she actually worked here with Tom Cade and Jim Weaver and everyone for several years. She'd live out there in the hawk barn and protect the birds, and make sure nothing got them at night or anything. And she came out with some young peregrines. This is I don't know, 78 or something like that. And years later, I took this picture of Phyllis with Tom Cade when he was visiting. She worked for John Fitzpatrick for years later, when he was director of the lab. I ended up getting to do a lot of interesting stuff with the Peregrine Fund. I went to Greenland a couple of times, and I'm with Bill Burnham, he was the president of the Peregrine Fund for about 20 years, but he's standing, this is in North Star Bay, he's standing right above a peregrine eyrie, and at that point, they thought that was the farthest north peregrine eyrie in existence. But we got it in our heads to go further north, and we just hit the trail. Jim Anderson was with us too, and Bill's son Kurt, and also Jack Stevens, and we were just in zodiacs then, a couple of zodiacs, and we found a couple of eyries farther north, and also some of the whitest gerfalcons I've ever seen. This is right by an eyrie, and that's like the chopping block, the bird, where they like to eat their food, and I'm holding up some dead dovekie parts, that the gyrs had eaten. And this was the next year, and that's Tom Cade up in the cab there. And we had a fancier boat then, but it had no cabin. I don't know what it is about these stoical guys, I mean, that's Tom on the right there. It was so cold up there. It's unbelievable. And this is in the middle of summer. You know, it was so bad. Tom wanted to recreate this expedition from 1905 where, you know, Alfred Bertelsen had gone up there and found all these, a Danish guy had found all these colonies of waterfowl plus nesting raptors and all kinds of things. And he'd read an article the guy wrote when he was in college, and he always wanted to do it. You know, he was in his 70s, thought, yeah, let's do it. You know, let's retrace the steps. So I got in on that somehow. But we finally we couldn't go any further. We couldn't check all the places. So he was able to get a helicopter somehow. And, you know, up we went. Which it was really interesting and fascinating, but also kind of scary, scary as hell. But I'll always remember that trip. There's so many things to remember from that, everything, all that, and the fact that these birds bounce back so strongly. And you know, I was at that Peregrine delisting celebration in 1999. It was Bill, the two Bills, you know. But such an amazing time. But then, 2000, the birds came back to Teganic. And I'm so sorry that, you know, Tom Cade died just a few months before that. He would have loved it. Oh, I wrote a piece for Audubon about it. And first time in 74 years, peregrines had been at Teganic. Just how amazing is that? Oh, and you know, this happened right in the heart of COVID time. So, you know, Teganic was a ghost town. You know, and all the students from Cornell and Ithaca College had gone home. They were learning remotely or something. And so it was great. I just hung out with these birds. Oh, and there's a blue jay that tried to get across the canyon. That young male there, he was so tame. He's got a full crop, so he's really gorged out, and he just doesn't want to move. And he was only like 12 feet away from me. And that was one at another eyrie, that other place. Oh, and here's a blue jay getting revenge. You know what goes around comes around. I like this because the female is always spending so many hours incubating those eggs, and the male happened to come in, and she just, it's your turn. she just booked it out of there. These are not all at Teganic. I monitor four kind of more or less local eyries. But you know, we're not. There are dangers. There are still dangers out there, and you know, these methane flares are kind of frightening. I don't think they wouldn't do the kind of widespread damage that DDT did, but they really kill a lot of raptors, a lot of red tails and things like that, and because they just come on sporadically. And they're at landfills and places like that, dumps. And it's good that they're burning off the methane because it's much worse than carbon dioxide for the atmosphere. But they got to do something to stop this. Put cages around them. Maybe put giant poles birds can sit on so they're not tempted to sit on one of these smokestacks. Because if they're sitting on it, they're toast. But this was a juvenile peregrine that came in the Finger Lakes Raptor Center. It was from the landfill at Seneca Falls. It just flew across a methane flare and its feathers melted. And yeah, I don't know if you're aware of this place, but they're over in Lodi. And Morgan Hateman started it and still runs it. I don't know if she's in here tonight, but
She talked here.
what?
She spoke here last year.
No, I know. I didn't know if she was sitting here tonight, but yeah. But you know, I volunteered to help with the bird because it's not. This is not like the kind of thing where a bird has a little bit of trouble. It's hungry or gets a slight injury. This bird had to be completely molted. You know, even there's a falconry technique called imping where you can kind of graft feathers in with a little imping needle and glue, but this would be every single flight feather, and it just seemed too traumatic and just not a good idea. And even her cover feathers were all, messed up and brittle. Everything was brittle, and it takes a long time to molt. At least 6 months for them to lose all their feathers, but she finally did become like a beautiful adult, and I didn't want to, after she molted, she was done molting by November, but I wanted to exercise her then because she'd just been in a little chamber. It's, you can get away with that with some birds like a red tail or something where they're just dropping out catching rodents and things like that. But these birds are really extreme, like jet fighter planes or something. So you see she's sitting on, that's called a lure. It's like a little leather sort of stuffed artificial bird that you tie a little bit of meat to. And you do something like, you swing this lure around like that, and the birds come in and they try to snatch it out of the air, and it's like a matador. You twitch it out of the way, and so they're diving, until they get winded. So I was doing that with her until, so that she'd be as fit as possible, and then I'm going to let her go next month. I was just waiting for the warm weather to come, which is always a little iffy in Ithaca. I would have done it in April, but I thought, well, you better wait till May. And this actually, I took this movie, it's pretty bad, I gotta apologize. I took it about a week and a half ago, and I let her go, and then I put my iPhone in my glove hand, and it worked okay at first, I'm just doing that, but then I gotta get this darn lure. It's usually, for me, a two-hand deal. I'm holding the way for me to do it, and, but you can see she really, she loves to fly. Sometimes she really goes up high, but there's a point in here where I'm trying to take the lure out and the phone's going all over the place, so I apologize for that. Yeah, I see that first. She roused her feathers. They do that when they're really happy, Okay, got to start swinging the lure now. Come on. I fly her every day, except I skipped this morning because I didn't want to lose her and then searching for her all day. I'm sort of worried about my talk. Yeah. I know you probably need Dramamine to watch this. Of course, I'm getting the glove fingers on the front of the lens. Oh, there. you know, it was so hard, I just tossed it on the ground. Fortunately, she dove at it about 5 or 6 times just when it was on the ground, just gave herself a little workout. I didn't have to do anything. She's making sure it's dead. But you know, that's a good workout. Got it. But unfortunately, there are worse things than out there than that, than the methane flares. You know, I'm really worried about highly pathogenic avian influenza. I wrote this piece for Audubon about, I don't know, a year and a half ago now, but fortunately, it hasn't seemed to hit us around here yet. It's mostly the coastal birds that are, you know, some of the eyries like in New Jersey and Virginia have been hit hard. The coastal ones, not the inland, not the ones in cities. And it's because they eat a lot of waterfowl there and shorebirds, which are getting hammered more than the other things. And then Puget Sound, I've got a friend who's a researcher out there. They've had a lot of problems. But, and you know, avian influenza was something that used to sweep through every few years and usually just go away. This has been worse. This has been really lethal. Years ago in the 90s, I did some work in Iceland with Oliver Nielsen, an Icelandic ornithologist, studies gyrfalcons. And we went out there, we banded 52 young gyrfalcons in about a week and a half. It was amazing. You could not do that today. They've gotten like more than half reduction in the number of nesting gyrfalcons. You know, they've been seen eating, you know, sick gannets and things like that, and they just fly up and die. And so it's a huge worry, and that's a country that's about the size of Ohio. So this is something I worry about. That's why I really am monitoring things here. I just wonder, you know, I talk about all those people back in the day who brought back the peregrine, and it wasn't just these key people, but the people who would go to eyries, the hack sites, and they just camp out there and monitor all over, tons of people. And it was such an inspiring thing. Is that going to happen again if this kind of thing happens? You know, and how would we do it? Could we inoculate the birds? It might be that you'd have to bring them in for a couple months, inoculate them, and then do a booster and then release them. I don't know, but I have huge concerns. But anyway, I just want to end with a tribute to some of my friends who were very devoted to saving the peregrine back in the day and died way too young. And I want to dedicate this talk to Tom Cade. So I'm open for questions. I said everything. Okay.
In some publication I read, I thought I read that this white barn over here that we drive by on the way to the lab
Kip's barn, yeah.
had some role in Cade's work. Did he ever keep falcons in there?
No.
No? Okay.
No, they keep it. They used to keep beagles in there. I mean, that used to be the dog barn. Beagles, way back. And Charlie Walcott used to keep pigeons by there, and he had a dark room. I used to use a dark room that was in there, but they didn't. I mean, it's possible they might have stored stuff in there and that kind of thing, but the hawk barns were.
We raised chickens and quail there.
Oh, got it. Okay. Yeah, good. You were part of the deal, so you know more about it than I did. I came here just after they left. I came here in 1990. Yeah.
So what other falcon species were affected
DDT? Oh, well, I mean, certainly peregrines and merlins and things like that, yeah. And
So their population didn't crash like peregrines?
well, peregrines were got it the worst, you know, because of the things they were preying on were things that really ate a lot of, you know, yeah. You know, when you think of like prairie falcons didn't get hammered much, but they're eating other stuff. They're eating ground squirrels and chuckwalla lizards and all kinds of things, and desert species, not ones that are out necessarily in a farmer's field. Some of them were, but you know, not. So they had it easier than peregrines. And then you think of the peregrines in the Pacific, the Peel's peregrines. They were in pretty good shape. They were living on miralets and things like that. But basically, any bird that was eating a high percentage of birds that were feeding in agricultural places, and you know.
So what was the food chain? DDT is an insecticide. The peregrines weren't eating insects, were they? So what
No, but the birds, the insect-eating birds were eating insects, and then the peregrines were eating them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Where was the hawk barn? It's not around anymore, is it?
Well, no, I'm always turned around when I'm in this thing because, you know, it was across, you know, sort of where there's a parking lot over by where it was, you know. Well, Peter, you. I'm in here. I'm all turned around, right? Because people are always asking me that. Well, where is it? You know, and so I should know. I even kept a bird in there at one point for a while.
So are the peregrines today being hit harder by the avian flu than other birds of prey?
Well, no. I mean, bald eagles are getting hammered in some places, and you know, it's. Yeah. Well, the condors were fortunate enough. They were able to legally get some of the vaccine, but it's really restricted in America. You know, people aren't getting to use it, and I think the poultry people don't want it to come in because I think once they inoculate their poultry, those birds always test positive. But so what, you know? They got a special exception for the condors, but you know, I would love to vaccinate this bird before I let her go next month, but it's not an option. Way back, Jane.
This is not a question, it's just a comment that I couldn't help noticing how so many men falconers are so handsome.
Back in the day, yeah, back then, yeah. Well, you know, the sad part was, back then, there were very, very few women falconers, and now there are tons of them. And I just say, you know, what happened? I mean, I lost so many girlfriends when I was, you know, growing up because I'd lose a bird, you know, just before telemetry even. And, I can remember going to a phone booth and it was about 8 o'clock at night or something, and I called my girlfriends. We were having dinner with my parents. It was 7. We were supposed to be there at 6:30. Oh, I lost my Merlin. And that was, I'd never heard from her again. But one who was a falconer herself might have understood.
In the footage that you showed of Jim Weaver placing the young peregrines, I think it was 1975.
Oh, in Colorado?
No, in Ithaca. I'm sorry, maybe you got the.
Oh, but you know, I was going to say a lot of those Western ones, they did have parents, and they'd take away those thin-shelled eggs and they'd put young in their place.
I may have got the year wrong, but I'm thinking specifically of the footage when they tried to place.
Oh, Ithaca.
In Ithaca.
Yeah, that was 75.
75. Okay, so I noticed that the space that they were trying to create the eyrie in was very rectangular, and then it seemed visually similar to what I saw in the photographs that you showed later when the birds came back in 2020. So I was wondering, one, is it the same space? And
No.
Two, no. And
No. It's a natural cliff. It's.
Okay.
It's.
But in 75, Was that a natural space, or had that been created?
I think they kind of created it and chiseled. Peter, do you know?
They built that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it was. I don't think that was a natural ledge at all. I think they sort of built a framework and everything. It's great to have people I can call out to, you know. The hook is coming.
I'm sorry, we'd love to go on, but we have to go.
Yeah.
So thank you, Tim, for a wonderful talk.
You're welcome.